my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again today from Dickens' stories about children, and today the story is Dick Swiveller and the Marchioness. Richard Swiveller, a good-hearted though somewhat erratic young man, the clerk of Sampson Brass, a scheming lawyer, often found time hanging heavily on his hands. And for the better preservation of his cheerfulness, therefore, and to prevent his faculties from rusting, provided himself with a cribbage board and pack of cards, and accustomed himself to play at cribbage with a dummy for 20, 30, or sometimes even 50,000 pounds aside, besides many hazardous bets to a considerable amount. Excuse me. As these games were very silently conducted, notwithstanding the magnitude of the interests involved, Mr. Swiveller began to think that on those evenings when Mr. and Miss Brass were out, he heard a kind of snorting or hard breathing sound in the direction of the door, which it occurred to him, after some reflection, must proceed from the small servant who always had a cold from damp living. Looking intently that way one night, he plainly distinguished an eye gleaming and glistening at the keyhole, and having no doubt that his suspicions were correct, he stole softly to the door and pounced upon her before she was aware of his approach. "Oh, I didn't mean any harm indeed. Upon my word I didn't," cried the small servant, struggling like a much larger one. "It's so very dull downstairs. Please don't you tell upon me. Please don't." "Tell upon you?" said Dick. "Do you mean to say you were looking through the keyhole for company?" "Yes, upon my word I was," replied the small servant. "How long have you been cooling your eye there?" said Dick. "Oh, ever since you first began to play them cards, and long before." "Well, come in," he said after a little consideration. "Here, sit down, and I'll teach you how to play." "Oh, I dursn't do it," rejoined the small servant. "Miss Sally'd kill me if she knowed I came up here." "Have you got a fire downstairs?" said Dick. "A very little one," replied the small servant. "Miss Sally couldn't kill me if she knowed I'd went down there, so I'll come," said Richard, putting the cards into his pocket. "Why, how thin you are! What do you mean by it?" "It ain't my fault." "Could you eat any bread and meat?" said Dick, taking down his hat. "Yes. Ah, I thought so. Did you ever taste beer?" "Excuse me." "I had a sip of it once," said the small servant. "Here's a state of things," cried Mr. Swiveller, raising his eyes to the ceiling. "She never tasted it. It can't be tasted in a sip. Why, how old are you?" "I don't know." Mr. Swiveller opened his eyes very wide and appeared thoughtful for a moment. Then, bidding the child mind the door until he came back, vanished straight away. Presently he returned, followed by the boy from the public-house, who bore in one hand a plate of bread and beef, and in the other a great pot filled with some very fragrant compound, which sent forth a grateful steam, and was indeed choice pearl, made after a particular recipe which Mr. Swiveller had imparted to the landlord at a period when he was down in his books and desirous to conciliate his friendship. Relieving the boy of his burden at the door and charging his little companion to fasten it to prevent surprise, Mr. Swiveller followed her into the kitchen. "There," said Richard, putting the plate before her. "First of all, clear that off, and then you'll see what's next." The small servant needed no second bidding, and the plate was soon empty. "Next," said Dick, handing the pearl, "take a pull at that, but moderate your transports, you know, for you're not used to it." "Well, is it good?" "Oh, isn't it?" said the small servant. Mr. Swiveller appeared gratified beyond all expression by this reply, and took a long draught himself, steadfastly regarding his companion while he did so. These preliminaries disposed of, he applied himself to teaching her the game, which she soon learned tolerably well, being both sharp-witted and cunning. "Now," said Mr. Swiveller, putting 2 sixpences into a saucer, and trimming the wretched candle when the cards had been cut and dealt, "those are the stakes. If you win, you get 'em all. If I win, I get 'em. To make it seem more real and pleasant, I shall call you the Marchioness. Do you hear?" The small servant nodded. "Then, Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, "fire away." The Marchioness, holding her cards very tightly in both hands, considered which to play, and Mr. Swiveller, assuming the gay and fashionable air which such society required, took another pull at the tankard and waited for her to lead. Mr. Swiveller and his partner played several rubbers with varying success until the loss of 3 sixpences, the gradual sinking of the pearl, and the striking of 10 o'clock combined to render that gentleman mindful of the flight of time and the expediency of withdrawing before Mr. Sampson and Miss Sally Brass returned. "With which object in view, Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller gravely, I shall ask your ladyship's permission to put the board in my pocket and to retire from the presence when I have finished this tankard, merely observing, Marchioness, that since life like a river is flowing, I care not how fast it rolls on, ma'am, on, while such pearl on the bank still is growing, and such eyes light the waves as they run. Marchioness, your health. You will excuse my wearing my hat, but the palace is damp, and the marble floor is, if I may be allowed the expression, sloppy. As a precaution against this latter inconvenience, Mr. Swiveller had been sitting for some time with his feet on the hob, in which attitude he now gave utterance to these apologetic observations, and slowly sipped the last choice drops of nectar. The Baron Sampsono Brasso and his fair sister are, you tell me, at the play? Said Mr. Swiveller, leaning his left arm heavily upon the table, and raising his voice and his right leg after the manner of a theatrical bandit. The Marchioness nodded. Ha! Said Mr. Swiveller with a portentous frown. 'Tis well, Marchioness, but no matter, some wine there, ho! He illustrated these melodramatic morsels by handing the tankard to himself with great humility, receiving it haughtily, drinking from it thirstily, and smacking his lips fiercely. The small servant, who was not so well acquainted with theatrical conventionalities as Mr. Swiveller, having indeed never seen a play or heard one spoken of except by some chance through chinks of doors and in other forbidden places, was rather alarmed by demonstrations so novel in their nature, and showed her concern so plainly in her looks that Mr. Swiveller felt it necessary to discharge his brigand manner for one more suitable to private life, as he asked, "Do they often go where glory waits 'em and leave you here?" "Oh, yes, I believe they do," returned the small servant. "Miss Sally's such a oner for that, she is." "Such a what?" said Dick. "Such a oner," returned the Marchioness. After a moment's reflection, Mr. Swiveller determined to forego his responsible duty of setting her right, and to suffer her to talk on, as it was evident that her tongue was loosened by the pearl, and her opportunities for conversation were not so frequent as to render a momentary check of little consequence. "They sometimes go to see Mr. Quilp," said the small servant with a shrewd look. "They go to many places, bless you." "Is Mr. Brass a oner?" said Dick. "Not half what Miss Sally is, he isn't," replied the small servant, shaking her head. "Excuse me." "Bless you, he'd never do anything without her." "Oh, he wouldn't he?" said Dick. "Miss Sally keeps him in such order," said the small servant. "He always asks her advice, he does, and he catches it sometimes. Bless you, you wouldn't believe how much he catches it." "I suppose," said Dick, "that they consult together a good deal, and talk about a great many people. About me, for instance, sometimes, eh, Marchioness?" The Marchioness nodded amazingly. "Complimentary?" said Mr. Swiveller. The Marchioness changed the motion of her head, which had not yet left off nodding, and suddenly began to shake it from side to side with a vehemence which threatened to dislocate her neck. "Humph!" Dick muttered. "Would it be any breach of confidence, Marchioness, to relate what they say of the humble individual who has now the honor to—" "Miss Sally says you're a funny chap," replied his friend. "Well, Marchioness," said Swiveller, "that's not uncomplimentary. Merriment, Marchioness, is not a bad or degrading quality. Old King Cole was himself a merry old soul, if we may put any faith in the pages of history." "But she says," pursued his companion, "that you ain't to be trusted." "Why, really, Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller thoughtfully, "several ladies and gentlemen, not exactly professional persons, but tradespeople, ma'am, tradespeople, have made the same remark. The obscure citizen who keeps the hotel over the way inclined strongly to that opinion tonight when I ordered him to prepare the banquet. It's a popular prejudice, Marchioness, and yet I am sure I don't know why, for I have been trusted in my time to a considerable amount, and I can safely say that I never forsook my trust until it deserted me, never. Mr. Brass is of the same opinion, I suppose?" His friend nodded again with a cunning look which seemed to hint that Mr. Brass held stronger opinions on the subject than his sister, and seeming to recollect herself, added imploringly, "But don't you ever tell upon me, or I shall be beat to death." "Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, rising, "the word of a gentleman is as good as his bond, sometimes better, as in the present case, where his bond might prove but a doubtful sort of security. I am your friend, and I hope we shall play many more rubbers together in the same saloon. But, Marchioness," added Richard, stopping on his way to the door, and wheeling slowly around upon the small servant who was following with the candle, "it occurs to me that you must be in the constant habit of airing your eye at keyholes to know all this." "I only wanted," replied the trembling Marchioness, "to know where the key of the safe was hid, that was all, and I wouldn't have taken much if I had found it, only enough to squench my hunger." "You didn't find it, then?" said Dick. "But of course you didn't, or you'd be plumper. Good night, Marchioness. Fare thee well, and if forever, then forever fare thee well, and put up the chain, Marchioness, in case of accidents. With this parting injunction, Mr. Swiveller emerged from the house, and feeling that he had by this time taken quite as much to drink as promised to be good for his constitution, Pearl being a rather strong and heady compound, wisely resolved to betake himself to his lodgings, and to bed at once. Homeward he went, therefore, and his apartments, for he still retained the plural fiction. Being at no great distance from the office, he was soon seated in his own bedchamber, where, having pulled off one boot and forgotten the other, he fell into deep cogitation. "This Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, folding his arms, "is a very extraordinary person, surrounded by mysteries, ignorant of the taste of beer, unacquainted with her own name, which is less remarkable, and taking a limited view of society through the keyholes of doors. Can these things be her destiny, or is some unknown person started in opposition to the decrees of fate? It is a most inscrutable and unmitigated staggerer." When his meditations had attained this satisfactory point, he became aware of his remaining boot, of which, with unimpaired solemnity, he proceeded to divest himself, shaking his head with exceeding gravity all the time and sighing deeply. "These rubbers," said Mr. Swiveller, putting on his nightcap in exactly the same style as he wore his hat, "remind me of the matrimonial fireside. My old girl, Chegg's wife, plays cribbage, all fours alike. She rings the changes on 'em now. From sport to sport they hurry her, to banish her regrets, and when they win a smile from her, they think that she forgets, but she don't. By this time, I should say," added Richard, getting his left cheek into profile, and looking complacently at the reflection of a very little scrap of whisker in the looking-glass, "by this time, I should say, the iron has entered into her soul. It serves her right." Melting from the stern and obdurate into the tender and pathetic mood, Mr. Swiveller groaned a little, walked wildly up and down, and even made a show of tearing his hair, which, however, he thought better of, and wrenched the tassel from his nightcap instead. At last, undressing himself with a gloomy resolution, he got into bed. Some men in his blighted position would have taken to drinking, but as Mr. Swiveller had taken to that before, he only took, on receiving the news that his girl was lost to him forever, to playing the flute, thinking after mature consideration that it was a good, sound, dismal occupation, not only in unison with his own sad thoughts, but calculated to awaken a fellow feeling in the bosom of his neighbors. In pursuance of this resolution, he now drew a little table to his bedside, and arranging the light and a small oblong music book to the best advantage, took his flute from its box and began to play most mournfully. The air was "Away with Melancholy," a composition which, when it is played very slowly on the flute in bed, with the further disadvantage of being performed by a gentleman but imperfectly acquainted with the instrument, who repeats one note a great many times before he can find the next, has not a lively effect. Yet for half the night or more, Mr. Swiveller, lying sometimes on his back with his eyes upon the ceiling, and sometimes half out of bed to correct himself by the book, played this unhappy tune over and over again, never leaving off, save for a minute or two at a time, to take breath and soliloquize about the Marchioness, and then beginning again with renewed vigor. It was not until he had quite exhausted his several subjects of meditation, and had breathed into the flute the whole sentiment of the Pearl down to its very dregs, and had nearly maddened the people of the house, and at both the next doors and over the way, that he shut up the music book, extinguished the candle, and finding himself greatly lightened and relieved in his mind, turned round and fell asleep. Dick continued his friendly relations toward the Marchioness, and when he fell ill with typhoid fever, his little friend nursed him back to health. Just after this illness, an aunt of his died and left him quite a large sum of money, a portion of which he used to educate the Marchioness, whom he afterward married. This is from Charles Dickens' book, The Old Curiosity Shop. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.